Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, Dale and I are especially delighted to be joined by John Andrew Bryant, who's recently written this book published by Lexham, A Quiet Mind to Suffer With, Mental Illness, Trauma, and the Death of Christ. I think this book was first mentioned on our podcast because when Matthew Lepine's Logic of the Body was released, he had mentioned that this was kind of in process. Maybe that was a couple of years ago. And so I've been anxiously awaiting this book ever since, particularly because there's not a lot of Christian writing that maybe I should add with the qualification that's very good on the subject of on the subject of maybe there's exceptions I'm unaware of, but on the subject of something like OCD that really, especially the mental illness and the trauma related to what is an increasingly common experience in the modern era, which is that of OCD. But before, I don't want to foreground too much information. I want to get right to John here. John, one of the things I really found fascinating in this book is the maybe you could tell me if I'm missing this, but like there's almost a translation of what you typically hear maybe in the therapeutic world into almost kind of a phenomenological experiential language. So am I hearing correctly when you talk about kind of, instead of saying OCD, you speak about the realm of ceaseless cognition, and then you speak about the kind of body waiting for the world to end, and I'm hearing body keeps the score, and that sort of
right. Yeah.
Am I detecting rightly that there's a kind of translation of what often just kind of is maybe less potent therapeutic language, not that that's a bad thing, but into something that is more textured in your experience? I'm curious what that process was for you, or how that if I'm detecting a translation and how that helped you.
Yeah, I think learning to I work with people where technical words aren't the most helpful. And so finding ways to say what a thing is in a way that also makes sense with lived experience is really crucial. I think to my ministry and my work, and for myself, I was like, how do you tell somebody what OCD is like? You could say it's this or that. I said, well, what about a car alarm going off in your car that's really loud and obnoxious, but isn't really telling you much because that's just car alarms go off all the time. And people were like, oh, you mean like that? And I said, yeah, something like that. Or I said, have you ever been in a wind tunnel? I said, or been going upstream, walking upstream of something and feel that tug on you that makes it impossible to kind of step forward. They were like, yeah. I was like, well, that's kind of what it's like to live with this siren that I call it. It's but it's almost I think a translation is a great word for it. The symptoms are there. How to find language that's both helpful, simple, and provides a map. I really wanted to turn my experience of an affliction into a kind of spiritual adventure, almost like a picture book spiritual adventure. You make your way away from the siren. You walk through the wilderness of the symptoms of the illness itself without the compulsions. You make your way to a sort of promised land. I kind of remapped, in some ways, Israel's journey and kind of in terms that made sense to me, out of pride and lies, which is where the siren lives and the stronghold of it, through trouble and loss, which is just dealing with it as an affliction rather than submitting to the siren's commands, and then trying to make some headway towards being present in my life again, which is the promised land, I think, for people with mental health. Is how do you get back into your life, even if it's painful? How do you get back there? And those were the kind of retranslated storybook words I found for the journey and the experience.
Yeah, very good. Let me ask you, I read the book. I think Joe mentioned we have a mutual friend in Matthew Lepine, and I spoke with him after we had him on the podcast to go over Logic of the Body. He's a wonderful man. I met him at ETS, and we exchanged numbers, and we started chatting. because his work, Logic of the Body, really emerged out of personal experiences that he was trying to sort of map theologically, but with using the literature, but also phenomenologically, kind of like what you're doing. But to hear his story about what the work emerged out of, really contextualized a lot of the words in the book. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit, as much as you're comfortable with, about when this started for you. Like, has this been something that you've sort of become aware that was there your whole life, or was there an event that happened to sort of trigger it? Or did you just sort of recognize it the older you got? And so maybe you can tell us a little about just your personal story, because that's like what the book is. It's just about you as a person.
Well, I don't think I knew what was going on until I was 30.
Hmm.
I think I knew I was anxious. I knew that there was propensities towards obsessive behavior or OCD, but the problem was my compulsions were inside my head. So I didn't, I would check things, I would do quirky things that sort of like that gets flung out about, oh, I'm so OCD, and what they really just mean is I'm quirky and I'm particular about some things. And I wasn't exhibiting those. I was just in my head all the time, ruminating about thoughts that were not voluntary but were there anyway, and trying to manage worries or concerns that I knew were bizarre but somehow seemed very credible, or that my brain was telling me were credible worries. And
Mm.
so what had to happen was I joke with my friends is like, you can manage something until you can't.
Yep.
And I think in college, I could manage my OCD in lots of ways. One, I mean, hyper ruminating can make for great papers, for thorough, thorough readings. It can make for really, I mean, there's parts of it that are still great. I sort of let my OCD run wild when I'm writing because it gets me places that I wouldn't be otherwise. But when it came to managing the concerns and uncertainties of everyday life, became incredibly, incredibly maladaptive in ways that I didn't know how to manage except by ruminating, which just got me to a point where I was in my house and couldn't leave my house.
Mm.
And also had intrusive thoughts that my desire to make them go away was just making them more bizarre and upsetting to me. And so that's when I was like, okay, I can't leave the house. These intrusive thoughts won't stop, and because I'm getting upset, my body's getting upset. They're making the thoughts, compulsions are making them worse. It just became a crisis point, and so I just said, I gotta, like, let's go where you go when you don't know what's going on. Let's go to the funeral. And so because the intrusive thoughts were upsetting and nightmarish, when you tell people what's going on, they're like, well, we need to make sure you're not psychotic.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until maybe 24 hours into my psych ward state that they were like, we don't think you're psychotic. We think you have, like you said, you have OCD. And I was like, yeah, we think that that's what's happening. We're sorry that this scared you so much, but it's actually just your disorder. And then I had to spend 5 years. I think I wrote the book. Took me 3 years to write the book, sort of remapping chaos, which is what it felt. I mean, the
Mm.
number one thing people tell me mental illness feels like, regardless of what it is the word chaos comes to mind, is what they always. So it was chaos for me, learning how to map it and say, okay, here's what I think is the obsessions. Here's what the compulsion came to be. Here's what happens when I took forever to get sorted out, and still sorting it out is taking. There's stuff I thought I was the master of OCD by now. Like, oh, that's OCD. That's not really in my head, and I'm still finding out. Dang, man, I've been listening to my brain on that point or this thing for years, and thought I had it all figured out. So still learning.
Yeah.
But yes, I guess the point being, a crisis point made it so that both the severity of the illness was unveiled, but also began the journey to map out the chaos of it, a theological landscape that provided,
Mm.
I think, ultimately was healing. It was just really painful.
Yeah. the that's fascinating to hear. Part of the reason this book resonated with me so much is I identify with quite a bit of it in very personal ways. And similarly, I'm 41 now, but I don't gather that even the basic sense of what was going on in my head, just the very idea that I'm in a always in my head, just noticing, in fact, being able to notice, having the language to notice, in fact, that maybe there's a kind of lack of attachment to the world, that you're kind of up here and the world itself is kind of grayed out, and getting out of your head into the world took a lot. It didn't happen. And the older I've gotten, I'm 41 now, so it's been about 10 years since I've even had that in my head. But what you just said deeply resonates with me, that you discover all the time. You discover all the time ways in which your habits, your mode of relating to the world is rooted in a very, just a long held habit of moving almost exclusively through the mind, as it were. One of the things that really helped me in the book, I must say, and in fact even came at just a good time for me, was your discussion of the part of what I gather you're trying to do is to you talk about this thing called the realm of ceaseless cognition, which is effectively living in your head and in these thoughts that are going around and you can never get out of them. And of course, if you're a wordy person, as you can tell that I am, what you try to do is you try to meet the discourse in your mind and try to guide it. You try to win it and you try to persuade it. But of course, you can't actually keep up. And one of the things that I think you do in the book that's really effective, because you have that going on, the kind of realm of ceaseless cognition. You have this prop that you call the sirens, which are kind of the screams in your head, you might say, the accuser plus whatever, the anxiety, whatever, that's screaming while you're trying to think your way out of it. And part of what I think is so helpful for people who struggle with this in the book is that you try to identify modes of orientation that are outside of that. In other words, you're kind of helping people understand your instinct is going to be to try and use tools from within here to combat the screams and to win whatever's going on in the spiral. And part of your whole book, it seems to me, is to say you actually need to have, and you use the word understanding, you actually need to have this pinprick of light, this very, very, very basic, small, it's the smallest piece of orientation that really is outside of all of that. And that relativizes all of that. And I'm reminded of I'm sure you're a theologically educated person, so I'm sure you've heard of these people trying to imagine kind of the ancient Near Eastern cosmos, right? That you have kind of the death waters above, you have the death waters below, and you have like death on every side. And creation is almost like this canopy that holds at bay, the death waters, that if God's word didn't hold back the waters, it would all just come swooping in. And as I was reading what you were saying, it's almost as though you were portraying a mode of cognition where the death waters can be all around you. It's not that they go away. It's not that the screams are fully gone. It's not that the realm, the spiral is gone, but there is a way perhaps to have something quieter, in a way, a very small quietness that is in its mysteriously louder in its own way than all the screams. Something like that. Yeah.
No, that's it's an amazing, say, rendition or riff or translation of what I was saying in the book. Yeah, absolutely. I had to figure out if trust was the same as thoughts and feelings, and not that there wasn't a relationship there, but were my thoughts, where if I had bad thoughts, was I then a bad person? Could these so overwhelm me that I did not have a self? And what was a self? And so going back to the scriptures, finding, and someone told me it was a very Lutheran book, this idea that by hearing promises, trust is resurrected in a person who is outside of thoughts and feelings. Not that he doesn't work with, but that he's outside. His reality is outside of thoughts and feelings. I used in the book this. I think I forget the movie. It was 1917. It was the book about the. It was the movie where it follows two soldiers in the First World War, and they're
Right.
making their way, and they get caught in a mine, and it's collapsing all around them, and there's a gap, there's a chasm, and one person's blinded, the other person's on the other side, and everything in him, all thoughts, all feelings, everything he's hearing is telling him don't jump, and his friend says trust me, jump. And I think those sort of leaps that we make by hearing promises are sort of have more to do with the self ultimately
Yes.
than thoughts and feelings that are ultimately not that they don't tell us things. Certainly sometimes they do. Situate OC my brain just creating upsetness for me. That took a long time, but ultimately what I found was there is a way to live in such a way that thoughts and feelings I develop a healthier relationship with them by not handing over my trust entirely to them. And for me to enter into that discourse with OCD thoughts is to already lost. As soon as you start
Yep.
talking
Exactly.
with them, it's an unwinnable game.
Yep.
You're already in the quicksand. But
Exactly.
learning to hear it and say, how do I? My joke is everyone knows the only way to leave a haunted house is to walk out of it. If you sit there and punch every ghost coming at you, there's just more ghosts. There's more horrors. And really, what you do is you find a banister that leads you down the stairs, and then you walk out the door. But
Yep.
learning to do that every day by hearing promises, and I had to sort of what is Scripture doing when Scripture? What is it trying to give me a guidebook for living? I said no. Scripture wants to reveal Jesus to me as someone who can be trusted, and trusted because he died and rose again, trusted because his mercies, his forgiveness, and his company are present in death and resurrection, and present by his means of grace that makes the power of his death and resurrection effective in the human heart to resurrect trust. And I was like, oh my gosh, these categories of faith are actually really helpful
Yes.
for people trying to make their way out of their head. If we can just remap it so that faith isn't creating shame, but actually is giving us that little corner of quiet to say, you actually begin here. From here, we walk out of the haunted house. But it's a daily.
Yeah.
I wake up every day in the haunted house. I got to make my way out again. But
Yep.
but I do know how to follow the breadcrumb trail better than I did 5 years ago, right? Like
It was a
there's
difference.
yeah.
I say to people sometimes the difference between 1 and 2 is 1, but the difference between 0 and 1 is infinite.
That's great.
And
Yeah.
I think that that's what it feels like to have even that. I think if you have OCD, any orientation that helps you realize this actually can stop, like not stop, that's the wrong way to put it, but you can actually have a life while this is going on that's not this. And I think that that's incredibly profound and helpful, I think.
Yeah.
So there was a story I wish I could, if I have a moment, I wish I could include it in the book. It's Kurt Vonnegut's son, Mark Vonnegut, wrote a book about his bipolar disorder. And he wrote that he's a doctor, and he says, and part of his bipolar was having some signs that we would normally associate with schizophrenia, but can also be apparently part of bipolar, which that he would see every day. He would walk to work and he would see Abraham Lincoln, Wonder Woman, and the Hulk across the street. And they were beckoning him to come to them. And he knew that to go that direction was to give in. And he said, I look at them and I say, I'm sorry, but I have things to do today. And then he turns and heads towards work. And I think that's the best possible relationship I've found to the OCD thoughts and feelings that I know aren't real. Is I'd look at them and I'd say, sorry, I got things to do today. I gotta head this way. Anyway, that was a little story to
No,
piggyback
that's
off what you're
wonderful.
saying.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned shame. I want to talk about that for just a second. I have a someone very close to me who has recently started to experience pretty severe intrusive thoughts. And when this person started texting me about it, because your book actually came out at a very critical point in my. Actually, I got your manuscript. I didn't get your book. It was before it was published, and it was at a very strange part of my life where I was just starting to experience the, so I had my first panic attack and went to the hospital because I thought I was dying of a heart attack.
Mhm.
And then it just kept happening every day. And then I started to talk with my doctor and they're giving me supplements. But anyway, I was having these intrusive thoughts. I didn't know what to do with it. And then I read your book. And I remember I was on vacation in Georgia when I read the part about you waking up and feeling the sunlight on your skin. And that was like the first time where you're like, there's some, like, things are gonna be okay. It was like when you were starting to emerge out of like the blackest fog of the episode. Which I started crying and I broke down and my wife is like, is everything okay? I'm like, it's so beautiful. But so this person that's close to me has been texting me and I said, one thing that I've tried to do is just recognize one thing, and that's that Jesus loves me. That's it. That's it. And Jesus even loves me with the intrusive thoughts that I have. So he doesn't like love me except for that. And it's like, well, I love you, but you're really going to have to clean that up for me to like really love you, right? Because this is the way we think. Kelly Kapic wrote a book a couple years ago called You're Only Human, where he talks about evangelicals have this relationship with Jesus where it's like Jesus is kind of like our older brother at the party, which is why we get in, but he doesn't really like us. And that's been something that I have to, you're talking about promises, but for people that are experiencing these sort of intrusive thoughts and they feel shame about it, like, oh my goodness, I had this very blasphemous thought.
Mhm.
Does that mean that I'm a blasphemous person? And is my subconscious really the thing that I actually am that's escaping from underneath? What is it that, like, is there I know it's the recognition of sort of objective promises that you're talking about, but what is the first move to sort of snap that,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah. And I remember being one day so overrun with them. I just was like, they were like rats clinging to me and talk about that. And they cling to you, and the cling is just that unclean. I am unclean because of these thoughts. And I think the first move, I, you know, I for me, the said, what does this mean? I think that's the key. Shame has an interpretive function. This means I am bad. This means I am. This certainly means I'm unclean. This means I am now. I have lost honor. I have lost regard in this world with myself because these things cling to me like this. And finding out that the intrusive thoughts, that the magic that the therapists tell you, everyone tells you, just how do you get there? Is once you realize they don't mean anything, you can move on. But the first problem is that we trust them, that we trust that these thoughts are telling us something about ourselves or about our real heart. We always think, oh, I wonder if somewhere in the corner of my life, I actually really am this bad. And I just remember thinking, how can the Lord's mercy and these horrors inhabit the same person?
Yes.
Which is, I know the Lord loves me, and yet I am experiencing horrors. And how can this understanding inhabit that same, like, and for me, I just kept going to the Psalms about waiting. What am I doing when I am not arguing with an intrusive thought, not even trying to make it go, just type of arguing, to say my brain is providing horrors that are unwanted, non-voluntary, and yet there they are. And the stillness to not make them go away or to fight them off, for me, was that stillness of faith. I was like, man, is faith this thing where you don't try to make it right? And I think that's all the Christians doing with OCD all the time. I knew, let's make these bad thoughts into good thoughts, or let's get them out somehow. And I'm thinking, but if by nature of this affliction, this is unchosen, what if it's possible to be completely in the right, righteous, just by trusting that this isn't true and isn't something that you are creating, and that the fog of it will burn off. But how to sit there in that and say, okay, the good Christian in me wants to fight it off, but fighting it off is somehow tangled up in pride that says I can make these things go away.
Mm.
And what if the Lord wants to actually say the trust is that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything about you. And that's where I think I found this weird. And I don't, how do you, it's like, I just remember in the psych word specifically, the Lord said, stop defending yourself and go home. And I, not like a verbal
Right.
word to me, but I was reading the Gospels, reading the Psalms, and I just had this sense that I did not have to take a swing at every intrusive thought coming my way, and that the Lord's word would take care of even the most blasphemous things. The Lord's word at the cross had taken care of, and I could trust that by not engaging in a compulsion, which I think is what I wasn't understanding. There was thoughts I was having on the movie screen of my head that were not voluntary, part of the affliction. And then there was my contribution, as you were saying, about joining the discourse, arguing back, fighting. I didn't have to do that part. The thoughts were going to be there, but I didn't have to take a swing at them. I could walk through the fog of it, or just sit and see that they didn't get to win. They didn't overrun reality. But that is so incredibly painful. I don't know how people do it who don't. I both feel like faith can be an enemy to the mental health journey, and the best friend. Because if you're sitting there thinking, this makes me unclean before God, it's like, oh no, we got to unwork that. But if you're sitting there and you're thinking, come at me, bro, like I stand at the foot of the cross. I know this isn't something I'm creating, and I know the Lord's got my back on this, and I'm just going to sit here, and then you just see the fog gradually disappear, and you're like, oh, that was the answer.
Yeah.
And that's hard because it's all, again, I'm thinking, is that really how it works, John? Is that my OCD's like, did you get it right, John? Is that really how you get out of there?
Yes.
Like,
your OCD doesn't allow you get out of the research and development phase of its own cure. You have to stay there.
Right.
Your answers.
Right.
One of the things that I do for the organization Dale and I are a part of, I teach at Davenant Hall, but the main focus of my own academic work is on the question of kind of what is modernity and interpreting modernity. Actually, the book I published with Lexham came out just a couple months before yours did. One of my friends recently said something to me I found really profound, which was, Joe, I wonder if modern people are as psychologically sick as our ancestors were physically sick. And the more I've kind of read people who have interpreted, even for the last 100 years, even somebody like Herman Bavinck, even somebody like C.S. Lewis, when they look out at the modern world, the common diagnostic of just kind of post-industrial life is this living in the frenzy, and especially living with a relationship to kind of frenzied clock time, where we never slow down, where there's a million moving parts. And I've wondered if relative to this kind of material, if there's an argument to be made that the frenzy in our heads, like what we're doing to our heads, is creating this machine that is moving with all of these balls we're juggling of sorts. And one of the reasons this is significant then is that I think these things are far more common than people realize. Like, there are extreme cases, but that tendency of us to kind of have a detached relationship to the world, where it really does take quite a journey of health, a journey back into reality, to even feel like things are real or something like that, to even sense that the world of this place, and even a moment, that a moment of time has a kind of fullness, as opposed to a thing I'm just pushing through like this, like I'm pushing through everything, bits of data, bits of moments, bits of people, church. There's something, in other words, I wonder if, like, OCD in one sense seems to me to be almost a symptom of the modern world, and yet it's also perhaps in as much as somebody has a bad case of it, this is a very hard world to live in for somebody in the realm of ceaseless competition, because the amount of just sheer data inputs in a day when you're in that discursive spiral is really astounding. And I wonder if that kind of resonates with you, because I think that we're in a moment where people who struggle with these things, the world is not helping you.
Yeah.
The world is helping you get worse in a way.
Yeah, the world is, it's like this weird thing where it's like the world creates the problem that blames you for having it. There's like a weird, reminded me of the gambling sign. Here's Harris Casino. Here's this casino. By the way, if you have a gambling problem, a little thing on the thing, and it's this thing. Well, actually, everything in the casino is designed to turn you into an addict, and then once you develop an addiction, it becomes your problem. And this world is not created for the anxious mind. So much of my experience with people of my generation, particularly, is so lonely, so little trust in any institution outside of, their own maybe a little group of friends or a little group of sub-interests in certain things, and a total trust of thoughts and feelings, because there's very little commitments outside of thoughts and feelings that would mitigate or put that trust in a helpful framework, or put those thoughts and feelings in a helpful framework. I was just like, how did we lose so much? I'm not one of those people who's like, our generation's the worst, but I was like, man,
Yes.
how did we lose trust with every institution? How did our world get so small and yet so overwhelming that it's really just our thoughts and our feelings, and yet we're bombarded by a world? How did we lose friendships? Why is, I'm so incredibly, my mind is so incredibly relationally tied to just small personal things, that I can forget the wider idea of like, how did, when I was 9, why did I think it was a good idea to just play video games all day? Like, why did my parents make me? And they did. Like, I did band, I did basketball, I did all this stuff,
Right.
but there's still this sense of like, what did we lose? It's like our world became incredibly small, isolated, and in its isolation felt overwhelming. I don't know. I resonate with the question, and I have no idea.
It is an interesting question, and something Joe and I talk about like all the time.
Yep.
It's this thing, which is to say, it's talking about everything all the time, because it's connected to all the things, right? It's like, what's going on? Jordan Peterson came out, superstardom, political controversies, cranks out this book, 10 Rules for Life. Resonates deeply with millions of young men that are isolated, lonely, detached, held together on the internet by sub-interest groups of people that are interested in these things that are not very popular. And then they hear this guy say, like, go clean your bedroom. And they're like, okay, this is the way for a happy life. And I do think that there's something to that. I don't know. So in my own experience, I guess I'll just say that I struggle with anxious feelings. I never sit still. So my body is constantly moving, constantly. And my mind is constantly moving. And I find relief when I am in high energetic situations that demand all of my mental powers be sort of focused on a solution, solving things. So what I do for a living, when people ask me what I do for a living, I say I solve problems. That's all I do. But being in the middle of that, I feel very comfortable. It's the moment when I sit down and like the thing that's chasing me catches up and sort of hits me, and then I'm like, oh, and then the body starts freaking out when you try to chill.
Yeah.
But in the moment of like bearing responsibility and keeping the mind focused on something other than the self, on objective responsibilities that demand your creative energies to solve, has been in some sense at least dealing with the symptoms for me. If it's not a solution, and I think the only solution is like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it's where I agree with you. But at least in my everyday algorithm of existence, I have found relief in bearing responsibility even though it kind of makes it a bit more difficult to deal with on the back end, if that makes sense. So my question is, do you think there's something to a life that sort of tries to get outside of itself by taking upon itself more responsibility? Or do you think that's probably good for some types? And I'm not talking about a sort of blanket solution. We're not going to solve OCD and anxiety on the podcast. But do you think that there is something, given the modern world and the world that we live in, to taking on more responsibility as part of our mental health, taking care of ourselves?
I think of those stories where, whether or not it was moral to do so. Two nursing homes, one nursing home that gave all the residents a goldfish or a small pet, and the other ones they didn't. And the group that had something outside of themselves by which they needed to, I would say, sacramentally offer the self to something outside the self by which to uh, share in life with, even if it was a goldfish, taking care of a goldfish, lived a lot longer. I don't know how many years, but it was a substantial experiment, and I forget the name of it. It was in a freshman psychology class. Sometimes OCD would always play trick with, and so I had to reframe getting better as what do I have now that I didn't have then 5 years ago? I have trust. I can trust in the Lord. I know how to, if I don't have, I know where to get it. I need to hear again. And then this strange word I never thought I would get back is my attention. And I believe the Spirit gradually leads our attention out of ourselves. And then the question was, something I never had was the intention to be given to the moment at hand. And that the self can be offered to the world in such a way that it is served, the Lord is revealed, even if it's just calling mom back because it's your mom, like making soup because someone's sick.
Yes.
To say, how do I, what is my way back into the world? Well, I need my trust and my attention need to somehow be pulled out of my head so that I can offer myself to the world. In some ways, that's this weird thing of like you get yourself back by giving yourself to the world. But I think it's deeply biblical, obviously. But to say my best moments were to say, I knew in more moments than before what to offer, how to offer. I felt more offered to the world.
Yes.
And I said that I could pay attention when someone was talking. That was new. It took years, but it was there. I said, my gosh, I can pay attention to you
Yes.
while you are talking to me.
Yeah.
It is painful because my brain doesn't like it. My body is some kind of figuring it all out because it wants to sit there and have me worry to create safety for it. But actually what I can do is where does this? And so I was like reframing death and resurrection. I was like, I wonder if, faith, hope, and love are these real gifts. But I wonder if by faith I mean trust, if hope I mean orientation, attention, or the leading of it at least. I can't promise we get it all back, but somehow my attention is being led. And I wonder if love's about the agony of being given back to the world in such a way that it's painful, but ultimately is a partaking of Christ himself. And I started reading Hans Boersma, The Sacramental Tapestry of Reality.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, it really matters to go swimming. It really matters to cook a meal. It really matters to clean my room. It matters in a weird way, sacramentally. Jesus is there. It's in the mix in a way that I would not have any data, any framework for 5 years ago to say, like, I'm getting better because I'm more given, more rescued, more led, more given to the moment at hand than I was 5 years ago. And that's what recovery needs to mean to me. More and more rather than less and less. I don't know if that jives in what you're saying, or even if you could still hear me if I'm cutting out again.
No, that's very profound, actually. Very similar reflections, actually, in I don't know if you've seen Joseph Pieper's little book, Faith, Hope, Love, on the theological virtues, but he excuse me, he has a fairly similar exegesis of kind of the significance of faith, hope, and love, and kind of how they work out existentially in a life. It's really, I found the treatment. I just happened to have had to read it this last week.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're also reminding me, in the Screw Tape letters, I've had to read that for the youth group I'm helping lead. Lewis is real fascinating when he has the demons talk about humans, and one of the things that Uncle Screwtape says at one point is humans always, just as we forget that they're bodies, because demons are disembodied for Lewis, they also always forget that they're bodies. And Lewis encourages Screwtape encourages Wormwood to sort of take advantage of the fact that the human tends to live in his head and is forgetting actually that he's a body. And so, for instance, just his placement of his body when he prays, that sort of thing. That doesn't mean God doesn't listen to your prayers without that. It's just that you're part an animal, and what you're doing with your body, like moving around and keeping a space and that sort of thing, has all of this impact on you. That's outside of the realm of cognition, in a sense, even though it does, from the outside impact the realm of cognition. One thing that in the book that I found especially helpful as well, because you talk about how part of the way out of it is there's a humility in the understanding of faith, and in fact a very painful, a death-like humility, in a sense, as you rightly point out, that I don't know that you ever use this word, but it strikes me that part of what you're trying to identify in that realm of ceaseless cognition and the siren and all this sort of thing is that in some ways it's functional for us. My friend Jim Pachta, who's my counselor, and Dale knows him real well as well, will often talk about this sort of thing is very functional for sinners. And I think you even ask at one point in the book, does just kind of self-contempt and self-loathing even? I don't remember you using the word functional, but the question seemed resonant with, is this functional for us in some way? Because part of the pride, I think, of something like the realm of ceaseless cognition and whatever is that A, you want to be able to be in control, and B, part of the thing you actually do wind up having to say when you're slaughtered, in a sense, by the act of faith, is just to say, I'm also not really in control of how much of a sinner I am. Part of the problem with the realm of ceaseless cognition is that you're trying to figure out, like, how much am I righteous and how much am I a sinner? Am I that bad or that bad? And in a sense, like, I've been real comforted thinking about this with Paul's statement, I don't judge myself before the day. What a boring question, how bad I am or how bad am I not? Because you can never exit that, but it's also to think about the self, and it's your desires in some sense. It's my desire to be on some, it's my desire for an answer to that question to be this rather than that. Well, I'm only this much of a sinner, I'm this righteous. That can kill you. One thing the book really helped me with is that kind of desire can kill you. And actually part of getting out of that is to, again, not part of faith is not judging yourself before the day. It's letting Christ be your judge, and your evaluator, and in a sense yourself, not I, but Christ in me. But then Christ is giving you yourself back as well in that exchange.
There's I remember we did a class on heresies in Sunday school, and my wife said the thing about heresies is that they make sense, and the hard thing about the gospel is it doesn't make sense. And she said and it's maybe it was just this heresy of saying the thing that says I can make it right or make it go away, or I talk about these losses that don't feel bearable. And that's where self-contempt comes in, I think, as this functional apparatus to say, it's like this self-contempt, self-hatred is this sort of last stand of pride that says, I can clothe my shame, get rid of self. Like, that's the last way. Somehow I can make things right. There's always this thing that says, I'm trying. It's like this weird paradoxical dependence on self, is that maybe I can make it right by hating myself.
Yes.
And to say you even lose that, you even lose the right to hate yourself. You even lose this sort of last bulwark of the self to say, well, I can at least pour contempt on me, right? That's something I get, and the Lord even takes that away and says, you don't even get to judge yourself. You don't even get to.
Yes.
You don't even get that's. And I think what I found with myself is I talk about the cry of the soul, and that's kind of weird language I wouldn't have used, but I was like, man, there's these real losses. The loss of honor is so hard it hurts so deeply a person. The loss of security, so profound, such a profound loss, and the loss of meaning and purpose is so profound, such a profound wound, and the pride that says I can make up for those losses is so deeply bonded with the losses themselves as to be indistinguishable, right? And it's like only the Lord's mercy can separate pride from loss and say, actually, part of this is you trying to make it right, and part of it's just like the loss itself.
Yeah.
And I think that openness. If someone was to ask me, like, what's this book about? I would say now, it's a book about grieving. It's a grieving book. It's a lament. Because when I lost pride, I suffered more. I suffered in different ways. I suffered that loss of control. I couldn't create honor for myself now. I had to wait for the Lord to clothe it with his righteousness. I couldn't control outcomes now, or at least I had the ability to not actively try to control them with my compulsions.
Yeah.
And ultimately, at the very end, it's like I couldn't even give my life meaning now. I couldn't give fulfillment to myself anymore by these compulsions, and I had to. And all those three were grieving. It's not the main point of the book, and I wish I'd given it more time. Is
Mm.
like the Psalms are so helpful. Cry out to the Lord for what you've lost. Otherwise, you're just going to hide it in some weird way with your pride or some other lie to say it's not there. But this sort of wild cry before the Lord of how are you going to make up for losses, Lord? How are you going to?
And blessed are those who mourn.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think this is, again, Dale and I's mutual friend, Jim, who's actually reading your book right now. I'm sure he's okay with me saying that. He's whoa, sorry, there's a bee chasing me here. He's gone. The devil. Anyway, uh, 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 Jim has a really profound story about being transformed through struggling with same-sex attraction and even transgenderism after getting married and having 3 kids, and suicidal and all these sorts of things. But kind of the beginning, his version of your story, the beginning of his story was just learning to grieve. Grief was kind of the piece that opened up, in a sense, the rest for him. And he's a counselor now, and is actually actively working through this. And I think that's I've been talking to him in the last couple of weeks. I think that's how this is resonating with him. Is very much a tale of grief in some ways, and so. I think that's very apt. One last thing I'll say before we close out, and then Dale, obviously, whatever you want to say. I really appreciate the translation of kind of body keeps the score language, and there's this famous book that everybody reads. It's like I guess like bestseller psychiatry books or something like that, and it's a very important book. The Body Keeps the Score, effectively arguing that trauma is not just stored in the memory. You can even have a mind that's kind of functioning okay in some way, but the body is in this hyper state of anticipation and sort of stores, stores in itself a worry and a set of traumas that it's going to react to. And I believe the way you put it was something like the body that's expecting the world to end, if I'm remembering that correctly. And I thought that was such a powerful way to describe. I think that's such a powerful way to describe something that in a lot of our pedagogy we're not very in touch with, which is that maybe, again, going back to modernity, and I think this when I think of seminary curriculums and even past the way that pastoral language is developed, very often we're targeting we tend toward kind of algorithmic engineer mind kinds of statements, right? And we sort of like, when we say like combat, error with truth, it's sort of like a spreadsheet of things. And it doesn't deal with it doesn't sometimes really get to the fact that for a lot of people, their very animality, they're animal in a sense. It really is in a state where it's expecting the world to end at any second. And it doesn't take much for the body and then the body kind of shooting a million messages into the mind, to be in a state of hyper panic, effectively.
Mhm.
And you can't, I think part of the profound thing there is then, of course, you can't just think that
Mhm.
posture of the body away, because the body's the reason the body the reason there are reasons, maybe that's just the way to put it, there just are reasons that the body is in that state of anticipation. And it's a long life of, and I'm guessing this is what you're experiencing over the last 5 years, is it's that long life of rhythms that's slowly persuading the body. It's
Mhm.
slowly getting
Mhm.
literally like getting a dog from a junkyard, or
Mhm.
something like that. Slowly calming the pit bull down to become a family dog,
Mhm.
as it were, something like that. And I just, that's really just me saying I find the description so helpful, in capturing an element of ordinary sanctification, the ordinary sanctification that, nevertheless, in the way that I think a lot of people really experience it right now. And so, really, I'm just saying I found that way of describing it very helpful and personally, extremely resonant. And putting that kind of label on it, I think, gestures the imagination toward the right orientation as well. I think it's just a more weirdly. I'm saying your label is better than the one on the most helpful book out there.
Well, I read that book at a critical time, maybe a year and a half out of 2 years out of the psych ward, and I knew what he was saying was true. The body keeps a score. And there's a lot of things I wished I would have picked up more from the thing. But when he said your body is not the same after a traumatic experience, and I don't know if he used this metaphor, but he said in the same way, if a storm blows through and knocks the lights out of a house, knocks the things out, what is the storm? What is trauma? Well, it's the storm that came through, but now it's the house. It's the house that's different, and your body isn't talking to itself the same. It's not connecting to itself the same. And I just knew I was like so deeply grateful for that book, because I was like, how do I explain to people that I'm 33 years old and my body is crying because it doesn't want to get out of bed, and the
Yeah.
dread is so powerful. And it's like I came out of the psych ward with certainly with a brain that was messed up, but my body was different now because it'd been so frightened by everything. It was such a break, and I could sit there and have the most rational day. And Matthew Lepine's book was so helpful as well.
Yeah.
And my body's just not convinced we're going to be okay, but I'm okay. I'm okay. I know it rational. I even know if that that quiet. I know I'm okay. Body's not convinced, and so these rhythms, the slows, and I think Matthew Lepine said it best, just this slow cultivation by these rhythms of these sanctifying rhythms to steward the body, because I can't get rid of it. It's my body. Like, what am I supposed to do with it?
Right.
I can't. I could try to outrun it. I could try to, but at the end of the day, I gotta steward it. It's mine. It's broken. It's something happened. It's
Yeah.
healing. It's healing slower than I want it to. It's taking years, and but it's mine. And by faith, I could steward its healing better. Um, but yeah, and I appreciate it, because that was the piece. I was like, man, trauma is so complicated, but at a very basic way, it's that your body's not the same now,
Yeah.
and
Right.
it's just not that something bad happened to you that you need to get over. It's like, no, I'm sorry, but your body's not talking to itself the way it should now, and it's going to take time. And that
Yeah.
was just helpful for me. I was like so grateful for that book, and it is an intentional. I should have put him in the acknowledgments, but because there was aspects of his descriptions where I was like, yes, okay. Now,
Yeah.
how do I say it in my way? But that's what I mean. I mean that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the body that expects the world to end.
Let the
I think
reader understand.
right.
Yeah.
I call him the stranger too. I said I woke up with a stranger in my rib cage, and there
Yeah.
he is.
Yeah.
My body's just like,
Yeah.
like, what do I do?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't have much more. I thank you. The last question I want to ask, but let me say thank you first. Thank you, brother. Thank you for writing the book, and I
Yes.
thank God for your life, and I thank God that um, Jesus is a good brother to you, and you know, keep pressing in the work you're doing, because I think it's not. Joe was saying earlier, I wonder if this is more common now. I think that you know, civilization is sort of mentally sick in proportion to our fathers were physically, and I think there's something
Mhm.
to that. So we're going to need more good work on this front so people don't feel alone. But last question for you, and then we'll wrap it up, is how are you doing now? How are things?
You know, even just this last few months, I'm at October's the 5-year kind of anniversary of my breakdown. So you travel every year. I travel through it, but with the book coming out and talking about it, the whole experience, when it happened, the breakdown that was the impetus for the book, is fresh. And but I have something I never had before, which is I don't believe my mind as much as I did 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I have just an incredible, it's God. I know it's the Lord. I can feel miserable and still pay attention to my life, and the people in it can still be loved by me. And I also know that things, the last, anniversaries dust things up, and then you just pass through them. So I would say it's been a hard, good thing to talk about the book. But and I would say I was just recently feeling like my OCD does not win, doesn't get to tell me what my life's going to look like, is a vindicated reality more and more each day. And sometimes when it's at its loudest, I know that that's the best victory, because it's screaming, trying to get me back, and me walking away from it is it sort of like the breakup, like this bad breakup.
Yeah.
So it's been a really deeply good season, but it's also been painful to remember. It's still painful to remember. It's not hard to talk about. I could hang with y'all all day talking, but when I remember how bad it was, it also just gives me an incredible compassion. Not that I'm a compassionate person by nature, but just suffering. The Lord's sorrows have to meet our suffering in ways that are a mystery to us, to lift us out of them. If I didn't know He was my friend in this affliction, I don't know how people make it without a friend like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I said to Christians, I say, the Lord wants to be your friend when your mind isn't. And I know that more than I did 5 years ago, which is the rejoicing. But to your question, been a hard month or two since the book comes out, I'm willing to, but to go through it again, and even just in talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, God bless you, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on. Go get the book. Joe, hold the book up. I don't think you did.
I threw the book, but here it is.
I have mine to suffer with.
Hey, look at that cover. Yeah. I forgot it looked like that.
Pick it up, check it out. Brother, thank you for your work. All right, everyone. As always, you can find previous episodes on the Davenant Institute YouTube page. You can also find us wherever podcasts are downloadable. But Brother John, thank you, sir. And Joe, I love you, brother.
Love you too, man. All right. See you.
It was a joy, guys. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Absolutely.